On a freezing November night, a broken woman sat alone on a bench, convinced her life was over and no home, no hope, no future. But when a widowed father of 5 struggling children chose to stop his car instead of driving past, one small act of kindness lit a spark that would change 7 lives forever. This is not just a story about rescue. It's a story about how the one who was saved ends up becoming the one who healed them all. Clara sat on the bench, as if the world had forgotten it was her turn to breathe. Rain-cooled air clung to her skin. People passed without looking. To them, she was just another silent figure soaked in loss. To herself, she was no one at all. Once there had been a life, a small one who clung to her fingers, a dream of family, of laughter echoing down narrow hallways. But tragedy does not give warnings. It only arrives, steals what it wants, and leaves behind a version of you that you no longer recognize. They had called her Barren, as if that single word erased her womanhood, her worth, her right to be loved. And so even the man she'd called her husband had turned away, choosing condemnation over compassion as Clara sat. Frozen, empty, invisible. Then a car slowed beside the curb. Elias hadn't planned to stop. His mind was already filled with the usual chaos. What the kids would eat, who needed help with homework, whose turn it was to do dishes. 5 boys, 5 different kinds of grief. A house that still echoed with their mother's absence. He carried it all quietly, day after day. But something about the way Clara sat, too still, too defeated, pulled at him. He rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" The word okay felt almost cruel. But she looked up, startled, and in her eyes he saw not danger, not deceit, only a brokenness that felt familiar. The same kind he saw in a mirror every morning, but he didn't ask for her story. He didn't need it. Instead, he handed her a paper bag of food he'd picked up for himself, then offered his jacket. And when the night deepened and the cold crept closer, Elias made a choice that would change both of their lives forever. He opened his passenger door. "Come with me," he said softly. "You don't have to be alone tonight." In that single moment, something long buried inside Clara flickered back to life. Not love, not trust, but something just as powerful: hope. Elias's house was not quiet. That it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't warm in the way people imagine a home should be. It was loud, unpredictable, and tangled in invisible sorrow. Shoes were scattered across the floor. School bags lay half open on chairs. The air carried the faint, permanent scent of cereal, detergent, and something heavier, grief that had settled deep into the walls. 5 8-year-old boys filled the space like small storms. Some fought too much. Some barely spoke at all. Others tried desperately to be the man of the house, even though their shoulders were far too small to carry such a burden. They had lost their mother just over a year ago, and in that time, something inside them had closed off to the world. When Elias opened the door and Clara stepped inside, silence fell. 5 sets of eyes locked onto her as if she were an intruder in sacred ground. "Who is she?" one of them asked, voice low and suspicious. "A friend," Elias replied carefully. "She just needs somewhere warm for the night." Friend, Clara swallowed hard. That word felt undeserved. Dangerous, as if she might break it simply by breathing. None of the boys moved. None smiled. One of them crossed his arms. Another narrowed his eyes. They did not see a woman in need. They only saw replacement. Threat. Stranger. Clara felt the weight of their judgment and chose not to run. The first night passed without much sleep. She lay awake on the couch, listening to the creaking floors, to the muffled sounds of restless dreams and whispered sobs from behind bedroom doors. It pulled open a part of herself she had kept sealed shut, the part that remembered lullabies, soft breaths against her chest, tiny hands curled around her finger. In the morning, she rose before the sun. The kitchen was unfamiliar, but simple. She found eggs in the fridge, bread, a single small jar of jam. With careful movements, she began to cook, letting the act ground her. Steadying fingers that once trembled in emptiness, the boys gathered slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the food to disappear the moment they touched it. "You don't have to," one muttered. "I know." Clara answered gently. But I want to. They ate in silence. Over the next few days, the boys watched her closely. They tested her boundaries in quiet but deliberate ways, spilling juice near her feet, hiding her shoes, whispering cruel questions like tiny knives. Are you going to leave too? Did God take your baby because you're bad? Are you here to be our new mom? Each question struck deep. Each one reopened wounds that had barely begun to close. But Clara didn't snap. She didn't scold. She didn't cry in front of them. Instead, she breathed and responded with kindness. It wasn't my baby's fault, she said to one, kneeling so her eyes met his. And it's not yours either. I won't stay if you don't want me, she told another softly. But I won't be cruel to you, even if you're angry. Their confusion slowly shifted to curiosity. She learned their names, then their stories. Marcus, who secretly cried into his pillow every night. Jordan, who refused to sit in his mother's old chair. Theo, who kept her favorite scarf hidden beneath his bed, afraid to let it go. Miles, who hadn't spoken in full sentences for months, and little Aaron, who clung to Elias's leg, terrified of loving again. Clara learned their patterns. Who hated broccoli, who needed the light left on, who liked stories. About heroes and who preferred silence. She memorized their nightmares, their favorite cartoons, the scars on their knees, and the heartbreak behind their eyes. She never demanded affection, never rushed their healing. Love, she knew, was not forced. It was earned in the quiet moments between brokenness and trust. One night, during a thunderstorm, the boys huddled together on the living room floor, shaking beneath a blanket they shared like a shield against the world. Without thinking, Clara joined them, not to replace anyone, but simply to be present. Her hands rubbed small backs. Her voice whispered calm words into the chaos of thunder. And for the first time in a long, long while they slept, Elias watched from the doorway. He had seen counselors try and fail. Family members give up. Friends drift away under the weight of sadness that filled his home. But here, in the dim light, was a woman who had been called Barren, yet somehow held more gentleness than anyone he'd ever known. That he didn't say anything. He only watched as grief slowly loosened its grip. Resistance had become curiosity. Curiosity had become comfort. And in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, something dangerous and beautiful was beginning to form. Not just kindness, not just gratitude, but the first fragile feeling of family. Clara had learned how to hide pain so well that even she sometimes forgot it was there. She folded it into quiet smiles, tucked it behind polite words, buried it inside acts of service. It had become a survival instinct, the art of appearing normal when the inside of you is still screaming. But Knight is honest. IT does not care how long you practice pretending that IT came for her on a Sunday evening when the children had already fallen asleep. The house was unusually still, wrapped in the gentle hush that only comes after exhaustion. Elias was on the other side of the couch, a dim lamp casting golden shadows over his tired face as he waited patiently for her to speak. He had noticed her shaking hands, the way her breathing grew shallow whenever silence stretched too long. He had seen the ghosts circling her long before she ever mentioned them. You don't have to tell me anything, he said quietly, but you don't have to carry it alone either. Those words cracked something open inside her, that Clara's eyes lingered on her own hands. Hands that had once cradled a child who was torn away from her. Hands that had been bruised, restrained, blamed. Hands that were now learning how to feel warm again. My husband, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't who the world thought he was. The room seemed to hold its breath. Tea first. The story came out slow, broken into fragments that tasted like ash in her mouth. 12 years of marriage, that was really 12 years of imprisonment. Rules disguised as love. Jealousy disguised as protection. Control disguised as devotion that he chose her clothes. Her words, her friends, her silence. Then the violence started. Quiet first. A grip too tight. A shove explained away. A bruise hidden beneath long sleeves and practice makeup. Until one night, it wasn't quiet at all. That was the night she realized she might not leave alive. And my baby, Clara swallowed hard, her chest tightening. He didn't take her because he loved her. He took her because she was a way to own me forever. Her eyes filled with agony as Elias leaned forward, listening, every muscle in his body drawn tight with restrained emotion. I ran. I tried to disappear, and he told the world I was dead, so I wouldn't be searched for, so I would be forgotten. And I let them believe it, because the only safety I had was being a ghost. Her words dissolved into soft, trembling sobs. She had expected rejection once the truth fell out. The same way people recoil from broken things. The same way her former life had cast her aside as barren, failed, unworthy. She had expected Elias to inch away, to see her only as danger, as complication, as history too heavy to touch. But he did not move away, he moved closer. Elias wrapped his arms around her carefully, as though she were made of glass and light. He didn't speak right away. He simply held her, not as someone trying to rescue a victim, but as a man recognizing another survivor standing on the same battlefield of loss. "You were never weak," he murmured. "You were surviving." Clara had never heard those words before, not from anyone, and something in her finally gave in. She cried not from fear this time, but from the release of 12 years held hostage inside her lungs. In a house once filled only with echoes of death. Two wounded souls found a strange kind of peace in one another's arms. From that moment on, the air between them changed. That IT wasn't filled with obligation. It wasn't wrapped in guilt. It bloomed slowly, unexpectedly, like wildflowers breaking through cracks in concrete. They didn't rush it. Their evenings became quiet rituals. After the children slept, they would sit together on the same couch where Clara had confessed her truth. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. There were moments of soft laughter, shared memories, and long silences that didn't feel empty. In that silence, they learned each other. Clara saw the fatigue behind Elias's strength, the loneliness that haunted a widower forced to be both mother and father. She noticed the way he traced invisible circles on the mug in his hands, the way his gaze drifted toward the old wedding photo he hadn't yet found the courage to take down. Elias saw the gentleness Clara tried to hide, the way her eyes lit up when one of the boys laughed, the way her voice softened when she spoke of simple hopes, gardens, books, mornings filled with peace. He had buried the idea of love the day his wife was lowered into the ground. But slowly, dangerously, it resurfaced one evening. As rain tapped softly against the windows, Clara fell asleep beside him mid-conversation. Her head rested against his shoulder, her body heavy with trust. Elias stilled, afraid to move, afraid even to breathe too loudly. His heart betrayed him. Then IT remembered how to feel. He realized with quiet certainty that the house was no longer just filled with grief. IT was filled with life again, with the boys, whose laughter now echoed more often than their crying, with Clara, who had woven herself into the broken fabric of their world without ever being asked to, and somewhere between shared dinners, whispered confessions, and healing touches, love took root, not the kind built on fantasy, but the kind born from pain, loyalty, and the silent promise of staying a love neither of them planned. Yet both had been desperately waiting for. Clara had almost begun to believe the past was finally behind her. The laughter in the house felt real now, the kind that filled hallways and spilled out through open windows on warm afternoons, the kind that replaced whispers of grief with ordinary chaos, dishes clinking, boys arguing over games, Elias humming while he cooked dinner. These were simple sounds, but to Clara, they were miraculous. For the first time in more than a decade, she slept through the night. And then the world reminded her that monsters do not always stay buried. She saw his face on a television screen in the corner of a grocery store. There he was, older, sharper, wrapped in a suit that made him look like power, like respect, like everything he had stolen from her. A Businessman of the Year award, praise for his leadership and philanthropy, applause echoing around him as if he were a hero. Clara's vision narrowed. The world tilted. Her hands began to shake so violently that a carton of milk slipped from her grasp and burst open on the floor. People stared. A worker rushed over, asking if she was okay. But Clara couldn't speak, because in that moment, She wasn't in a grocery store. She was in a locked room with no windows. She could feel his breath again, his voice, the invisible walls closing in around her. He had returned to the world, and he had found a light. She made it home in a fog, barely remembering the drive. When she stepped into the house, Elias was helping the boys with their homework. He looked up the moment he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked, rising to his feet. She could only whisper his name. "He's back." That night, the fear she hadn't felt in years came crashing back like a tidal wave. Her body trembled. Her mind spiraled. The idea that he existed freely in the same world again tore open every scar she had worked so hard to heal. But for the first time in her life, she was not alone in her fear. Elias sat beside her, his hand wrapped tightly around hers. The boys gathered close too, unsure of what exactly was happening but sensing the danger in the air. "He can't touch you," Elias said firmly. "Not this time, but he will try," she whispered. "He always does." Elias looked at her with a quiet, unshakable determination, the same strength that had carried 5 children through grief. "Then we fight. Together." The next weeks were an emotional storm. Clara began the hardest journey she had ever walked, telling the truth out loud. To lawyers, to investigators, to women's advocates who listened in stunned silence, as piece by piece, her story finally came into the light. Evidence surfaced. Medical reports buried years ago. Threatening messages saved on old devices that a former housekeeper who had heard the screams, that a neighbor who had witnessed bruises and arguments. Her death had allowed the abuser to move on untouched for years, but it had also preserved his lies in perfect condition, untouched by scrutiny. Until now, the media turned its gaze from praising him to questioning him. The name that once carried respect suddenly walked hand in hand with suspicion, and the moment word reached him that Clara was alive, he came for her again. Not physically, but with intimidation. Letters arrived with no return address. Voicemail messages with heavy silence that a car parked too long across the street. The old terror crept back in her bones. But now, every time her knees weakened, she looked behind her and saw them. 5 boys who refused to leave her side point one night. After Clara woke from a violent nightmare, she stepped into the hallway to find all 5 of them sitting on the floor, blankets wrapped around their shoulders like tiny soldiers. "We're your shield," Marcus said quietly. "He can't hurt you now," Jordan added. "Your family," whispered Aaron. And in that moment, Clara realized something earth-shattering. She had not lost her child forever. Life had simply expanded her heart and given her 5 more. The trial arrived like a storm cloud that refused to pass quietly. Courtroom benches filled. Cameras flashed outside. Supporters and protesters gathered, each side fueled by belief and disbelief. Clara had never imagined her life would be placed under such public examination. She almost didn't walk through the doors, but Elias held her hand, and the boys stood behind her. She stepped forward. Inside, the air was suffocating, heavy with judgment. When he entered, her abuser, his cold smile nearly broke her again. He looked at her like she was nothing more than a story he had already rewritten once before. But Clara didn't look away this time. She rose to the stand and told the world everything he had tried to erase. She spoke of the control, the isolation, the violence, the stolen child, the fake death that had become her only escape. Her words trembled at first, then grew stronger. If every sentence peeled another chain from her skin. The defense tried to twist her story, calling her unstable, attention seeking, broken. They painted her as a woman looking for sympathy, for revenge, for recognition. But they underestimated one thing. Truth, when carried by courage, is unstoppable. Point one by one. Witnesses stepped forward. Point one by one. Lies collapsed. The monster who once made her feel microscopic now sat shrinking in the same room where she finally stood tall. Outside the courthouse, the crowd waited in breathless tension. Inside, silence ruled as the jury returned. Clara sat between Elias and her newly found strength. Her hands were cold. Her heart raced. Her entire past sat on the edge of one word. The judge looked up and spoke, "Guilty." The word echoed through the room like thunder, and then like daylight. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for once, they weren't made of pain. They were made of freedom. The chains that wrapped around her life for 12 years shattered in a single sound, guilty. Elias pulled her into his arms. The boys rushed forward, their cries mixing with hers. All around them, people stood in stunned silence as a woman once erased by fear regained her identity in one moment of justice. Outside, cameras captured the scene, but none of them could ever truly capture what it meant. The woman who had been rejected, branded barren, buried alive by lies, now stood reborn, not as a victim, not as a ghost, but as a warrior, wrapped in the arms of the family she never believed she would have. For the first time, when Clara looked into the future, she was not afraid of it. And when she looked back at the past, it no longer owned her, because the verdict didn't just change the courtroom, that IT changed her soul forever. 6 months later, the garden behind the house no longer looked like an afterthought. Clara had filled it with color, soft blues, warm pinks, and bright yellow flowers that turned their faces toward the sun. Life, once fragile and gray, now stretched across the earth in full bloom. Bees hummed between petals, and butterflies rested on leaves like tiny blessings sent to remind them all that beauty still existed in the world. That IT was a peaceful morning, the kind that used to feel impossible. Inside the house, laughter echoed off the walls that had once carried only silence and sorrow. The boys ran through the halls in freshly pressed shirts, their voices tangled with excitement and nervous energy. "Don't wrinkle it," Clara called gently from the front room. "We can't help it, Miss C." Miles laughed, spinning in a circle. Miss C, the name they had chosen for her themselves. Not Mom, not a replacement, not a ghost filling an empty space, but something new, something theirs, and she cherished it more than any title she had ever dreamed of. Outside, Elias stood beneath an arch the boys had built together, curved branches tied together with twine, woven through with flowers from the garden. It was imperfect, a little crooked, and completely beautiful. Just like the life they had built, he adjusted his collar, trying to hide the way his hands trembled. He had faced grief. He had faced single fatherhood. He had faced the darkest nights of loneliness imaginable. But this moment, terrified him in the best way possible, because it wasn't built on loss. It was built on hope. Clara stepped out into the sunlight, dressed in simple white. No grand church, no expensive decorations, just truth, just love, just them. For a moment, everything else faded away. The years she had spent in fear, the labels that had been forced onto her, the word barren that had once stolen her worth. All of it disappeared as she walked toward the man who had chosen her when the world had chosen to forget her. Elias's eyes glistened. "You're real," he whispered as she reached him. "So are you," she smiled. "And so is this." The boys gathered close, forming a half circle around them. 5 small hearts that had been shattered, now standing strong, watching the moment that turned survival into family. "I'm not here to replace anyone," Clara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother is, and always will be, a part of you. I'm simply here to love you in the present and to never walk away." One by one, they stepped forward and hugged her, and oh feared and oh doubt, only acceptance. When Elias took her hands, the world grew quiet. "I don't need perfection," he told her. "I only need you, and the life we choose every day." "And I choose this life," Clara replied. "I choose this family." They didn't need an audience to declare it. They didn't need grand promises or fancy words, because their story had already written the only vow that mattered. "We stay point 0.7 broken hearts, point 0.1 unbreakable bond." And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light over the garden, Clara realized something she had never believed possible. She had not been rejected. She had been redirected to a love greater than she ever imagined. Not because life had finally become perfect, but because, in the end, love had won. That freezing bench was never her ending. It was the doorway to her real life. Point 1 man chose kindness. Point 1 woman chose courage. Point 5 children chose love. And together, They prove that even the most shattered lives can be rebuilt when someone finally decides to stop and care. Because sometimes the person you save on a hopeless night ends up saving you right back.